So basically, like, you know, I tear down the windows now, so I kind of go back through, like, I don't know. I was like researching.
Dear Colm, dear Friedhelm, dear guests, it's wonderful to welcome you all almost 1.5 years after the outbreak of the pandemic. And I'm particularly pleased that so many loyal supporters of the Thomas Mann House have joined us tonight. First of all, I'd like to highlight Vice Consul General of Los Angeles, Dirk Schulz, and also Stephen Levine, the chairman of our advisory board. You support us so much with your inspiration, your acumen, and also your wonderful network. You opened so many doors for our institution, and I'm really grateful for that. We are also honored by key partners of the Thomas Mann House, led by a truly impressive group of UCLA professors tonight, like Ephraim and Romy Sutherland Cristal, Aaron Crooney, Ani Landi and Sharon, Wendy Coates, Kalani Michelle, and Ashley Sanders, as well as Marjorie Perloff from Stanford, Michaela Ullmann from USC, and Ulrich Birkmeier from the Getty. I would also like to highlight our neighbors, especially Shirley and Merle Price. And we are particularly grateful to have 5 such distinguished Thomas Mann Fellows who once again fill this house with life. Literary scholar Friedhelm Marx, philosopher Rainer Forst, legal scholar Christoph Möllers, Michael Zürn, a political scientist, as well as Bernhard Pürksen, a media scholar. Since a few weeks, guests are walking in and out again at the Thomas Mann House. First cigars have been smoked on the terrace of the house, and the lawn you are sitting on became a field for soccer games between the Thomas Mann House and the Villa Aurora Fellows, our dear partner institution here in Pacific Palisades. All of this is wonderful to experience after so many months of existing primarily as a virtual institution. For today's reopening, there couldn't be a more fitting setting than a reading by the brilliant Irish author and literary scholar Colm Tóibín. In his latest novel, The Magician, he tells the life of Thomas Mann, beginning with his childhood in Lübeck to his marriage in Munich, and then from his opposition to the Nazis to American exile. German literary critic Marcel Reich-Ranitzky once said, "Germany, in my eyes, is Adolf Hitler and Thomas Mann." Now as then, these two names symbolize the two sides, the two possibilities of Germany. Colm will talk today about the personal upheavals of Thomas Mann and his life, and about the making of this house and the political discussions around the Mann family table. In the coming weeks, Colm is going to give readings from New York to London, from Munich to Berlin, and it's truly a privilege to have you as our guests here tonight. Colm will be in a conversation with our fellow Friedhelm Marx, and let me briefly introduce you to Friedhelm before he takes over. Friedhelm Marx is chair of modern German literature at the University of Bamberg. He's one of Germany's leading experts on Thomas Mann and researches contemporary German literature. In 1994, he received his doctorate in Bonn with his thesis on Goethe and Wieland, and in 2000, he became full professor at the University of Wuppertal with a thesis on Christ figures in the work of Thomas Mann. Friedhelm Marx has been vice president of the German Thomas Mann Society since 2006. Before closing, I'd like to thank our partners at Scribner and also at the Goethe Institute Ireland, as well as Benno Hertz, Betty Ramirez, and Josh Videra for their support in planning and the execution of this event. I would also like to thank Skylight Books Los Angeles, who will be offering books by Colm Tóibín for sale after this event. Colm promised that he would be happy to sign the books, and therefore there will be no audience questions today, but you're welcome to talk in person after the reception. Please feel free also to use the pool furniture and to gather around the pool after the event and just feel like at home. Lastly, please note this event will be recorded. It will be available on the Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House YouTube channel from September 19th on. I wish you a wonderful evening and a very warm Shana Tova. Please give it up for Colm Tóibín and Friedhelm Marx.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Nikolai. It's great to be here. And of course, I mean, I'm very glad to welcome Colm Tóibín. I'm very much looking forward to this event. I still can't believe it. And it's incredible in a way to sit here in this beautiful garden with this audience and talking about a novel which, well, takes place here in a way. I mean, covering the years of Thomas Mann in the United States, not only the years in the United States. And well, Colm told me the other day, he managed to enter the house here even before it was sold to the German government, which was very difficult. I think not very many people succeeded in entering the house. He must be very convincing. And he saw the study and things even before it was sort of open and changed into this to this house for fellows. So this evening is a kind of reunion, I should say. Well, it's the opposite. I mean, you don't have to knock on the door anymore. I mean, we are very glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And before we start the lecture and the talk, let me just give you some lines. I mean, to introduce Colm Tóibín. He was born in 1955 in Enniscorthy in the southeast of Ireland, well, close to Wexford. He studied at the University College in Dublin, and then he went for 3 years. It was 3 years to Barcelona. In the very wild, I should say, post-Franco era in 75 up to 78. He returned to Ireland and worked as a journalist first, and I think 1990 the first novel came out south, and it was followed by lots of novels. I won't name all the novels and short stories and plays and poems. Let me just mention two of them perhaps. There's this novel on Henry James, The Master. It came out in 2004. And the novel Nora Webster, that was 2014, I think, 2014, leading back to the region of his youth in Enniscorthy. And great novels, but we won't talk about these novels. We're talking about The Magician very soon. Of course, I mean, there are lots of prizes. I won't name them. There are lots of honored doctorates, honorary doctorates, and invitations to teach right now. I mean, after teaching at Princeton, Stanford, and other places, he's professor at Columbia University. I think during the fall semester you're over there. So, right now we are talking. Let's dive right into the novel, and just let me just ask you something in general. Thomas Mann, as an author, preferred to find things. I mean, he preferred finding things to inventing them. He didn't like to invent things. He stated this just to, in a way, I mean, to defend his own novel Buddenbrooks, because people thought, I mean, he just wrote something about Lübeck and things. He said it's a good thing to find things, but then you have to deepen them and you have to sort of enrich them. Well, I assume, I mean, you share this strategy of finding, forming, and deepening subjects. So, what did you find? What did you find remarkable in the life of Thomas Mann to write a novel about him, just in general? I mean, is there a single aspect that impressed you most?
I suppose there are two things. The first one is strange. It's a sort of unknowability in him that fascinated me and made me feel that in a way, to think as a novelist that you're going to be able to create a character that everybody would recognize as a person is, I think, slightly disingenuous, that you're almost just creating images that build up to something, but you can never be sure what that something is. And in Mann, it is that there are often contradictory images that creates something that is even more contradictory. That's the first thing. The second thing would be that he puzzles me deeply in 1914. I get all the rest of him, but the fact that he was so fired up as a sort of militarist, he wanted war in 1914. I couldn't deal, I found that very hard to understand until I looked, of course, at the sort of fervour in Ireland that led to the 1916 rebellion. Poets and academics suddenly became interested in having guns and marching and talking about blood. And so I sort of started to use things I knew to try and make some sense of his, in my view, loss of all good sense in those particular months, but also really throughout that First World War. So there are two things.
I see. That's very interesting. I mean, in a way, I mean, you're narrating not only the life of Thomas Mann, but the whole context, right? And it's a very wide context. I mean, from the very, as Nikolai pointed out, I mean, from the youth of Thomas Mann in Lübeck, with Munich, the wild Munich of the turn of the century, and then, of course, the First World War, and his engagement at the very beginning. I mean, and his change, his political change, well, up to the exile in the end. So it's really it's a book of history as well, of German history, right?
Yes, it's the long 20th century. I mean, the great thing about Henry James was that yes, he was around for the American Civil War, but he paid very little attention to it. He didn't fight in it. So that we have a period of great peace in Henry James's life going up to 1916. I mean, so I didn't have to deal with wars. There's a real problem in a novel if you have a war, because the novel is not made for that necessarily, which is that Stendhal, for example, in the Charterhouse of Parma, Fabrice, he's on a horse and he's really in love and he's thinking so deeply about love, and love really, is keeping him awake at night, love. But nearby is a place called Waterloo. And when he thought about it later, he thought, yes, I think I was at the Battle of Waterloo. There was a lot of noise and people coming and going and wounded. And oh dear, but Stendhal has a wonderful time with this joke over. That was just a minor thing, that battle. It was Fabrice as being in love. And this happens in Buddenbrooks, where suddenly you have the unification of Germany as a single reference. It isn't as though the family has a dinner to celebrate or there's marching in the street. In that instance, it's a throwaway line, because Tony Buddenbrooks might get married again. And if she gets married again, that's a much bigger question than the unification of Germany. So that you're always aware you have choices as a novelist, that you can become Tolstoy and write big set scenes in war. But what I was interested in was a sort of intimacy, a sort of inwardness, what happens to the spirit under those pressures, but at the same time you have to register them. So I found in 1914, which all of us know, a sort of local newsagent who had stronger militaristic views than even Thomas Mann did. It was always standing at the door in bad tulles of his shop, shouting out slogans. And that's how we learn that Thomas Mann is on his side. And that's how we learn that Heinrich Mann, his brother, is not, because the newsagent begins to denounce Heinrich. And so you try and find personal ways into those stories rather than doing set scenes with guns or tanks or trench warfare. So it's just a question of trying to stick to an original idea about intimacy.
That's right. Yeah. So you give the perspectives on politics, on wars, even wars. I mean, and of course, different countries. I mean, right now we are sitting here. It's the later part of Thomas Mann's life. If you read this novel, he seemed to have enjoyed very much, right? I mean, he seemed to like it here very much, and perhaps we should dive right in, and you give us some passages on Pacific Palisades.
Yes, I just wanted to say about money that he had more money than many of the other German emigres in Los Angeles, and he had money because his books really sold in America. He always had that income. I mean, obviously his wife was very rich, but that money had gone by this time. Once they were installed in Los Angeles, he and Katia, Thomas Mann's wife, agreed to look at a site that was for sale in Pacific Palisades, close to Santa Monica. They'd been renting a house, but now decided that they would build. They chose Julius Davidson to be their architect because they saw a conversion he had done of a house in Bel Air, but more than that, because they liked his aura of cool competence. He had a habit of looking away when they spoke, as though what they said required consideration, then staring soulfully into the distance while they waited for a response. Our architect has a mysterious inner life, Katia said, and that can only be good. Thomas and Katia walked around the foundations with Davidson, imagining the house that would soon rise here. Thomas dreamed of his study, where the desk would be and the bookcase. He noticed how beautifully dressed Davidson was, and was tempted to have Katia ask him where he bought his suits. Instead, he reminded him that he did not want floor-to-ceiling windows in his study. I want shadows. He said, I don't want to look out. He did an imitation of a man writing at a desk. I need to talk to you also about that built-in record player you mentioned, Thomas said. In the high summer, I thought, I would like to have sad chamber music on loud and clear, thus evoking the winter. Although they did all their business with him in German, Davidson seemed American. Even his way of walking around the site had nothing of German hesitancy and watchfulness about it. He behaved like a man who had spent his childhood on the prairie. He had become an American. He knew the planning laws and those who implemented them as if Los Angeles were a kind of village. He also had a way of speaking freely and easily about money that no German would risk. It struck Thomas that maybe one of his own children would soak in America like this, although as he pictured them one by one, each of them seemed stubbornly in possession of a Teutonic spirit and Teutonic virtues, if any still existed.
Well, thank you very much. You have it right here. I mean, the Davidson House, and we see the scene, sort of. I mean, the first encounter with this architect, and of course their interest. I mean, the study being the center. Well, it's a very informed book, I can tell you. I mean, I'm quite familiar with the life of Thomas Mann. It's very well informed. I mean, how do you deal with the bunch of information, I mean, which is there? I mean, we know almost everything about the life of Thomas Mann. I mean, we have the diaries of, well, the writing members of his family, and we have, of course, memoirs, even memoirs of Katia, the late ungeschriebene Memoiren. We have lots of information about Thomas Mann. Is it a treasure for you, I mean, to use, or is it even a burden? Because, you know, everybody could just look up and say, well, no, I mean, this encounter with Davidson, for instance, I mean, it didn't take place in the same way.
Yeah, the whole question then becomes almost an ethical one of how much you can make up and how much you must follow the facts. And how much in the middle somewhere is an idea of the spirit around the facts. I'm pretty suspicious of that notion that there is a thing called a factoid or a fact in inverted commas. Katia's memoir gives one extraordinary image, and from that image I think you can get a great deal more. She describes being in Venice with Tommy, her husband, in 1911. And she says, yes, there was a boy, a beautiful boy on the beach, and yes, Tommy could not stop looking at him. No, he didn't follow him in the streets. This he didn't do. But all the rest happened. And then she says that the book that came out, that when the story Death in Venice came out, she had an uncle by marriage, and he was really appalled by the tone of Death, a married man writing this story. The problem is that that uncle by marriage was dead by the time Death in Venice comes out. So here's a fact now. She has it in the memoir, but it couldn't be true. She got it wrong. She was writing many years later. But nonetheless, so you're working with A, shifting facts, but B, also that idea that as his wife, she was on the beach with him in Venice, and that she wasn't shocked. She didn't walk home in a huff, you know. So what did that mean? And that gave me a great insight into, you know, what sort of person she was. And I saw an interview with her where she seemed like a terribly good-humored, ironic person. And so that the idea then was, instead of making her the long-suffering wife of a closeted homosexual, you make her into something much more rich and much more interesting than that, using her intelligence all the time, finding the world more interesting than just being a victim of it. And so the marriage was oddly successful, which when you start a book like this, you don't think that could be possible. But I found that in every scene I made in the book, I could give Katia something funny, interesting, or sometimes she was more intelligent than he was. She saw politics more clearly than he did, and she led him. I think after the First World War especially, she led him back to some sort of good sense.
Yeah, that's right. It's even one of the main figures of the novel, right? I mean, it's called The Magician, but actually it's more just than one person. It's
The magician's wife. Yeah.
Well, okay. Yeah. Well, perhaps we just stick to this question for a second before you read another passage. Do you think there are certain spots, of the life of Thomas Mann still secluded, sort of blind spots, and you use, this form as a novel to shine a light on them?
Yes, I suppose the idea of him being a ghost at his own life, that somehow or other he spent his life living in shadows, imagining things. We talk about Buddenbrooks as being an autobiographical novel, but he did wipe out his 4 siblings in order to create Hanno, which I think is every novelist's dream, everyone's dream really, is that he just made an only child. And he made his mother, instead of Brazilian, he made her from Amsterdam, and he brought in the whole question of music. And this idea of music, I think, preoccupied him greatly as to what music meant, what it could do to the spirit. When he realized, when he came to Dr. Faustus, that music could poison the spirit, could unsettle the spirit sufficiently, that it would do damage to the spirit. And the very disturbing idea that the very music he loved, music of Wagner, the music of Beethoven, was also loved by others who really, really repelled him. And so that all of those ideas are there. The other thing that's there, I think that you probably know much more about, did I say probably? You know much more about than I do.
Come on.
Is Katia said once about him, don't ever ask Tommy anything, because he only knows what he put into the book or the essay. He never knows anything more than that. In other words, he wasn't a scholar, and he wasn't an academic.
It's the same for us, actually.
You must find in the essay sometimes that, and this I think matters a lot in the First World War, where he became entangled with a figure called Ernest Bertram, who knew much more than he did, and had read many more books than he had, and who sort of called every day, and really pushed him quite far in his sort of nationalism and his militarism, and became a Nazi later on, much to Mann's, I think, horror. But that idea that he wasn't as deep or as knowledgeable as everyone thought he was, and that he was, therefore, we have this last book of his, this miracle book, where he goes back to a story at the end of his life, thinking that he maybe has one more book in him. He goes back to a story of 40 years earlier about Felix Krull, who's a con man, a complete imposter. And this becomes his late work. We have this idea of late work being filled with images of, death and eternity and beauty. Mann decides actually to deal with the fact that all his life he was, in some way, a sort of imposter. And I sort of love that idea that the lightness in him, because we know all about the heaviness in him. He wrote heavy, sometimes, essays, and his way of presenting himself in public was weighty. But that at the end of his life, with 2 years to live, he threw it all away. He threw it all up in the air in this wonderfully light novel, where he parodied himself in I think, a most wonderful way.
Yeah, that's great. Came Felix Krull in a way, right?
Yeah.
So, shall we continue with another?
Yeah, we were talking about fact, and when someone had read this book and came to this house and said, "Where's the pomegranate tree?" And everyone said, "There's no pomegranate tree." And in the house that I live in LA, which is Heriel Colty's house, there is a pomegranate tree in the front, and there's a hammock in it. And for me, I come from Ireland, where we don't have pomegranate trees or hammocks. And you couldn't really go outside much for much of the year. The idea of lying in a pomegranate tree in a hammock for me is just an extraordinary idea of what California offers the human spirit. And so you must remember, when you see a pomegranate tree here, it's mine, it's not his. I just wanted to put a pomegranate tree into this book. And it didn't, it just didn't bother me too much that there really actually wasn't one. So actually, I'm going to not read the pomegranate tree section, but just to say, if you find a pomegranate tree in the garden here, just remember there isn't one, and that's what and that's what fiction is for. He had Thomas Mann had 6 children, and he loved some of them more than he loved others. He loved his daughter Erika, and he loved his daughter Elizabeth. With the boys, it was different. But he had a son called Michael, who was the youngest, and there was always a lot of tension between them. and Michael played the viola. And there's a moment when he has this house, and he feels he has rescued all of his children, got them to America, got his brother Heinrich and his sister-in-law Nellie to America. So all of them are here, and he wants something special. He wants a ceremony in the house. And he asks Michael if he will play Beethoven's Opus 132. Michael has a quartet, and if they could play this, and Michael says it is the most difficult. We are a new quartet. I know it is hard, but it has a special meaning. This is Thomas saying, it has a special meaning for me and your mother. And of course, Michael immediately realizes he's telling a lie here and says, spares the exaggeration. He's talking to his father. It does not have a special meaning for my mother. And then Thomas has to go and find Katia to tell her, please tell Michael it has a special meaning for you. But in any case, it happens. In this room here, they begin to play the quartet. When the music began, Thomas was struck by its daring, the quiet release of a sort of anguish, followed by a tone that suggested struggle, with hints that the struggle brought both pain and joy, immense joy. He knew, stop thinking, give up trying to find simple meaning in the music, but instead let it enter his spirit, listen to it as though he might never get another chance. It was hard not to look at the players, however, not to study their seriousness and concentration. Thomas watched them taking their cues from the lead violinist. The lead violinist and Michael on the viola seemed to spar, taking energy from each other. The music edged towards resolution and held back for a moment before it soared. He glanced at Katia, who smiled at him. This was the world of her parents, who had hosted many such chamber concerts in their house in Munich. Out of this old world from which they had been forced to flee, Michael had emerged as the one with musical talent. Thomas watched him playing with slow care, showing no emotion. As handsome and self-possessed, he let the viola's dark sound hit against the sweeter sound of the two violins. As the music continued, the lead violinist and the cellist shed some of their Americanness. The rangy, friendly, masculine openness apparent earlier was replaced, he saw, by vulnerability, sensitivity, until they could have been Germans or Hungarians from decades before. Maybe he thought it was merely something he imagined, something caused by the force of the four instruments playing together, as they found moments of pure connection with one another, and then went silent or played solo. But Thomas could entertain the idea that ghosts from an earlier time, ghosts who had once walked the streets of the European cities carrying instruments, ghosts on their way to rehearsal, were present here in this new house overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Southern California.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a very nice piece about music, which of course plays a very important, very big role in the life of Thomas Mann, and it's very important for his writing. In this scene, I think it's great to learn that it makes him unstable, and that seems to be very important for just creating. In this case, it's the novel Dr. Faustus. He has in mind in a way, or it's shaping. He's thinking about the two men actually. Adrian Leverkühn, of course, on the one side, and Serenus Seidblum on the other. So, do you think it's? I mean, it's very important for even Adrian Leverkühn in the novel. I think talks about this quartet of Beethoven and this effect of music. Is it the same actually for you? May I ask you? I mean, is it like there are pieces of music which sort of are very, very important for you as an author? I mean,
yes,
create,
that
you know?
I think a lot of people who knew that Beethoven's symphonies were so shocked when they found the quartets, especially the late quartets. In Barcelona, the British Institute would lend you LPs. You could take home and play for the weekend and bring them back on Monday. I just took the Quartetto Italiano, playing Opus 132, 131, 135, 127, and I was absolutely shocked by them. And to this day, I can find that moments in them, especially the change when he wasn't sticking to the sonata form, and when he was moving around, and when he was, I suppose, putting in a slow movement, sometimes the most joyful upbeat sort of sound. And I just thought that the breaking of the form and then the lifting of the spirit into extraordinary space. I'm at this stage 21, say, and this is really transforming. It's transfixing, and it remains so. And I mean, part of the pleasure, in a way, of being in New York in the winter is that there's a huge life for chamber music in the city, and you get to see performances of this. And so I sort of so I'm writing sometimes in this book directly from things that matter to me.
It seems to be important to be, in a way, unstable to write. I mean, to lose control, like it's right here in this scene. I mean, he seems to lose control listening to this music, and then there's this idea of this novel coming up all of a sudden. Well, perhaps, I mean, you talked about this pomegranate anecdote. Your tree, not the tree of Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann himself, I mean, he wrote a novel about Goethe, and for him it was very challenging, but at the same time very fascinating to, in a way, to become Goethe. So even to write a whole chapter in the first person, being Goethe for a chapter. You don't do that. I mean, you're not writing in the first person.
I don't take that risk.
But in a way, I mean, do you feel certain? I mean, do you become Thomas Mann to a certain extent? Writing this novel, or?
I think the first thing is that if anyone says, well, why would you write a novel when there's so many biographies? I mean, what's the point of fiction for this? And the alibi, in a way, is Thomas Mann himself writing his book about Goethe, which in English is called Lotte and Weimar. It's called The Beloved Returns, or Lotte and Weimar, which is about Goethe in old age falling in love. And I think there are personal things in that book too. I think there are things about the sort of erotic life that he wasn't writing about elsewhere and are in that book. I think he'd want to be a great idiot, really an imposter, a major imposter, to say that, I felt me and Thomas Mann were at one as I was writing. I didn't feel that for a moment. I mean, in other words, that there is, but nonetheless, the idea of him watching, in this novel he's watching all the time, his children are talking, there's always something going on, he's always coming out from his study to hear what the noise is. And he doesn't make noise in this book, he barely speaks in the book. And there is a sense then, as the novelist, of that's what I'm doing too. I'm watching these characters. I'm letting them make the noise. I'm not inserting, I mean, other than the pomegranate stuff, I'm not inserting areas of direct commentary of my own. And I wouldn't dare do the first person. It would be very difficult to do in English because you're always working with his voice from various translators, and it's a complex business.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Well, perhaps in a way, this book as a whole, I mean, there are some connections, similarities to the Master, your Henry James novel, and I was wondering, I mean, this time you decided to give the whole life in a way, as opposed to the Master, where it's only sort of an artist in his middle ages, just, well, of course, some memories about the past, but it's perhaps like a couple of years. So why did you decide to give it the whole piece, sort of? I mean, the whole life. I mean, you could have written a novel just about Thomas Mann, the American.
I could. The problem if you try and do that with Thomas Mann is that there are so many things in his past that are so vitally important to understand. You can't just have him buying this house, moving into it, and then memory coming to shake him or unsettle him in the same way as music does. Because what happened to him in the First World War requires, I think, to be dealt with in real time. That it's complex. It moves every year of those 4 years of the war. But also the death of his father in Lübeck and the loss of Lübeck. In other words, his father left a will saying that the business was to be wound up. The Manns were important people in the commercial life of Lübeck. He would, as a young man, he would have been recognized on the street. Suddenly, in Munich, they moved to Munich, he was nobody. And you have to do that not as flashback, but as to what it was like when you know only what happens before it and not after. I did everything to make this a much narrower focus. And every time I tried that, I found, no, you can't just have the First World War or the loss of Lübeck or the marriage to Katia as a memory. It has to actually be fixed in time as it occurred. And then I realized I'm back with the old clunky business of the biography, of the A, B, C, D, E, F, G part, the next year you went. And then I thought, well, I'll try it. And if ever I feel it's moving into the language of biography, I will cut that, whatever it is. I'll try and get that out. And the big problem, technical problem, is how do you deal with a man with 6 children in a novel? Name another novel that has six children. I wish he'd just had 3. And if he'd had 3, you could always have them, you'd know where each of them was at all times. But with this, where's Monica? Oh my God, I haven't mentioned Monica in 2 chapters. Bring Monica in. But if you bring her in just to bring her in, just for the sake of bringing her in, the reader goes, I know what you're doing, just bringing Monica. So you have to find a scene for Monica. Suddenly, Michael. And, and then, of course, Erika is fine because she's always just causing trouble. Klaus is fine because he's always just taking drugs and looking for money and having lovers. But Golo, what do you do with Golo? And then I found that during the Munich Revolution, they have a real problem because the servants are listening to everything and they make an order that Erika and Klaus must be quiet at all times, that they must not say that they're for the rebel, that they're for the Soviets, or that they're, they get them and they threaten them. But they forget there's a little fellow called Golo, the 3rd one. And Golo starts to move around the house saying, we're all going to be shot. We're all going to be shot. And he does it with glee. And they haven't silenced Golo. He's now become the problem. So that was a technical problem that you really took a lot of reading over the book to see, can I get Monica in here? And and it was good that Elizabeth got married so young because you could just send her away. So I mean, these are the problems. Thomas Mann says this at one point to Schoenberg. You can write about transfigured night. You can write about beauty, eternity, and the ineffable. I'm stuck with the buttons on someone's coat, and so too I'm stuck with the actual details of who's in the room. When have they last been in the room? And do the reader know exactly who they are in relation to each other? And there's a moment that is just, I think, I did it out of just badness, where, look, there are too many Klauses. I don't know if in Germany in general there are too many Klauses. But,
no, not really. No.
But,
not anymore, at least.
Like Katia Mann has a brother called, her twin brother is Klaus. He's Klaus Springsheim. Then there's Klaus, who is Klaus Mann. Thomas Mann's son. And then there's a boy called Klaus Hauser moves into the story, a boy they meet on an island that Thomas Mann becomes very interested in. So suddenly there are 3 Klauses. So I decided to have a dinner just to show what 3 Klauses would look like in a novel if you had 3. Like if you had 3 Madame Bovarys. what would happen to the novel if 2 other ones came into the room, Yeah. And so I mean, a lot of the time, where philosophers or composers are working with high ideas and poets can just do anything they want. You're novelists, you're stuck with the quotidian, you're stuck with the moment, you're stuck with counting things, and it's awful.
Come on, it's a great novel. I mean, it worked out, I can say. Well, it's a family, as you pointed out, it's a family novel in a way. It's not only the magician, it's the whole family, and even not only the family, it's even more, well, Schoenberg, Adorno, Einstein. I mean, a lot of famous people as well in this novel. Yeah. That's well. If you're talking about if we compare these 2 novels, I mean, do you think the artists, I mean, Henry James and Thomas Mann have a lot in common? I mean, you wrote 2 novels, one on Henry James, one on Thomas Mann. Do you think there's a certain elective relationship, something? Well, perhaps this image that they are cold at heart, or that they are lonely in a way, surrounded by a lot of people, or is it just speculation that I'm talking here?
They were both closeted, what we call now closeted homosexuals, and that's not enough for me. In other words, that's one thing. But the other things that interested me were to do with the loss of home, Thomas Mann's loss of Lübeck, and then his loss of Munich, so that when he's here, no matter where he is beyond the age of about 15, he's lost. And not that he is lost, but he has lost a world that he, in a way, sometimes, well, definitely in Buddenbrook, say, he attempts to recuperate through sentences, through words, and that's his aim in the study, is to get this place back that he has lost. And in a way, in this study here, when he's writing Dr. Faustus, he's back in this half-poisoned world, but nonetheless he's filled with, he puts his mother in the book, he puts his two sisters in the book, he puts elements of himself, he puts a whole world that's lost to him in the book. In the same way, Henry James was alone, much more alone than Thomas Mann. I mean, he moved to Rye in Sussex to be able to work more in his 50s with no one really that he knew in the area. So every evening he was alone. And the payoff was enormous. He got 3 great novels from it. But there were 5 years that were very lonely. And when I'm talking about loneliness, he lost so much along the way. I mean, in other words, he lost New England. He lost being with his family, and he was this strange, haunted figure. So I'm interested in that idea of writing coming out, not necessarily of trauma, because I think that's too easy, but out of ideas of loss, ideas of memory that can be both invented and then actually added to by the real thing, which happens in, say, Buddenbrooks, and happens also in the way that Henry James, the dramas he created about coming to Europe from America, of Isabel Archer, of Millie Thiel, of the Ververs, of them all coming to, having lost America and seeming not to have become at home. Their homelessness in those books is remarkable. So those things interest me as to how much of a writer's inner self makes its way into the books, not just by necessity, but by compulsion, by the absolute need to do this, because otherwise that house in Lübeck will be completely lost. It will be always lost if you don't write it down now. And the impulse coming out of that idea.
I can see that. Well, we already talked about Katia Mann, which is a very important figure in this novel. And well, you started, that's very surprising. I mean, you start the novel, I mean, you have to read not only the first pages, but you have it right there. You start with the mother of Thomas Mann, and she seems to be very important too. I mean, for me, it was really a new perspective. I mean, to see how important, I mean, this part, of his history in a way, the family history is. I mean, there's a perception of Thomas Mann being, the son of a businessman in a very tiny city in northern Germany. But we don't talk very much about his mother, and you do, which is very convincing in a way. And you do it at the beginning, and you do it at the end. So I don't know if you want to read the final pages.
Yeah, his mother came from Brazil, and she was born in Brazil, and she came as a young girl to Lübeck, and you can just imagine what that meant. In that, the story she could tell. So the novel opens with her describing what the stars on water looked like in Brazil, the fact there were no clouds in the sky in Brazil. And then she arrived in Lübeck and she found it was overcast all the time. A novel is 1,000 details, and a longish novel like this is probably 2,000, and you're always looking for the detail. And you often stop and say, no, I need one thing. I need something here. And I wanted an image of Lübeck after the bombing. So Thomas Mann goes back to it, just say that in this particular section, it's towards the end of his life, and the city is still not reconstructed. And I know there's a famous image there, because I saw it, which is the bells that fell down and were embedded in there. And I thought, if I bring him there, it's like bringing him to a sort of a thing that in guidebooks, or that is a well-known historical thing. So I found an image that began to really haunt me, which is that in the bombing was so severe that the grave of a composer called Buxtehude was dust. No one could know where anything had been in that grave now was. And Buxtehude really, he dominates life, or religious life, in Lübeck. In other words, any service you go to, there'll be an organist playing Buxtehude, a soprano singing Buxtehude, and a choir adding to the Buxtehude moment. He was from Lübeck. He was the organist for many years in Lübeck. And for Thomas Mann, finding out that his grave has completely turned to dust, it is a big image for him of what's been lost in Lübeck. And so he's wandering around Lübeck. He gets up early on a Sunday morning. Katia's back in Travemünde nearby, where she's still in bed, and he just gets a car and he goes into the city. And he has some marzipan, which Lübeck is famous for. And then just something just comes into his mind. And he starts to remember his mother. He was pleased he had taken a corner table since the cafe was filling up, and he was happy too that no one among the Sunday morning crowd recognized him. A story came to him. It must have been told by his mother, often when they were children. It was never referred to again, certainly not in Munich. It was a story about Buxtehude's daughter. Each year the story went when the young organist came, including Handel himself, to learn the secrets of his trade from Buxtehude. Buxtehude promised each one that he would tell him enough to make him the greatest composer in the world if he agreed to marry his youngest daughter, Anna Margareta. But even though his daughter was beautiful and accomplished, all the visitors refused, since all of them had romantic commitments at home, and therefore they left without learning the secret. And then as a suitor was finally found for his daughter, a suitor with no interest in music, Buxtehude was afraid that he would die and the secret would be lost to the world. Little did he know that a very young composer in Arnstadt had heard about him and had decided to walk all the way to Lübeck to see if he could discover the secret. Thomas, still in the cafe, paid his bill and walked towards his grandmother's house. He could see his two sisters now waiting for the rest of the story, both of them in their night attire, and he could see Heinrich, his brother, sitting apart from them. And always in the story, his mother would sigh and say that she had work to do and would continue the story tomorrow. And they would appeal to her, beg her to finish the story, and she always would. The young composer's name was Johann Sebastian Bach, she said, and he walked to Lübeck through wind and rain. By the way, I didn't make this up. I mean, this is actually something that did happen. Often he could find no boarding house, and he had to sleep in haystacks or in fields. Often he was hungry. Very often he was cold. But he was always sure of his purpose. If he could get to Lübeck, he would meet a man who would help him to become a great composer. Buxtehude was almost in despair. Some days he really believed that his sacred knowledge would be buried with him. On other days, in his heart, he knew that someone would come, and he dreamed that he would recognize the man immediately, and he would take him to the church, and he would share his secrets with him. How would he recognize the man? Carla asked. The man would have a light in his eyes or something special in his voice, his mother said. How could he be sure? Heinrich asked. Wait, he is still on his journey and worried, his mother went on. Every day, the walk seemed longer. He has told the man he works for that he will be away only a short time. He does not realize how far Lübeck is, but he does not turn back. He walks on and on, asking all the time how far Lübeck is. But it is so far that some people he meets have never heard of Lübeck, and they advise him to turn back, but he is determined not to. And eventually, when he reaches Lüneburg, he is told that he is not far from Lübeck. And the fame of Buxtehude has spread to there. But because of all his time on the road, poor Bach, normally so handsome, looks like a tramp. He knows that Buxtehude will never receive a man as badly dressed as he is, but he's lucky. A woman in Lüneburg, when she learns of Bach's plight, offers to lend him the clothes. She has seen the light in him. And so Bach arrives in Lübeck. When he asks for Buxtehude, he is told that he will be in the Marienkirche practicing the organ. And as soon as Bach steps into the church, Buxtehude senses that he is no longer alone. He stops playing and looks down from the gallery and sees Bach, and behind him he sees the light that Bach has carried with him all the way, something glowing in his spirit. And he knows that this is the man to whom he can tell the secret. But what is the secret? Thomas asked. If I tell you, will you promise to go to bed? Yes. It is called beauty. His mother said, the secret is called beauty. He told him not to be afraid, to put beauty into his music. And then for weeks and weeks and weeks, Buxtehude showed him how to do that. Did Bach ever give the woman back the clothes? Thomas asked. Yes, he did. On his way home and on her piano, yes, he did, on his way home. And on her piano, he played music for her that she thought came from heaven. Some windows Thomas saw in the old family house, the house of Buddenbrooks, were boarded up. The mayor had promised that the whole building would soon be restored. Lübeck, it appeared, was proud of it now, the house that had given life to a book. Thomas, as he stood in front of it, wished he could ask one of the others, Heinrich, Lula, Carla, Victor, if they too remembered that story about Buxtehude and Bach. It had not come into his mind for years. Maybe there were other stories that he would remember, long forgotten ones, that he'd heard in the company of the others who had also lived in this house and who had now moved out of time towards a realm whose boundaries were still unclear to him. He glanced to the house again and walked through the city towards the car that would take him back to Travemünde, where Katia would be waiting for him.
Thank you very much, Colm. It was that was a great passage. I mean, it's sort of it's not no spoiler in a way. It's the end of the novel, but it's no spoiler. And you heard it. It's all about beauty. It's a beautiful novel, I can tell you. And well, now we don't have to go to bed. As little
You
Thomas.
can stay up. We can stay up.
We can stay up, and I'm sure. I mean, you will have a lot of questions, but it might be easier to ask all these questions with a glass of wine or a little snack or so. So let me thank you very much, Colm, for this great lecture and the talk. And thank you very much for being here and, of course, for staying here. There are a lot of books, I mean, to buy. And
and thank you very much. Right? Yes, I've signed them, but if you want them personalised, I'll add that. Look, Friedhelm, thank you very much for doing this. It's very generous of you. And Nikolai, thank you very much for all your hospitality and to all your team. And indeed, thank you to the German government for recreating this house. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was
great.